I think of this book as the result of a strategy that I've tried to follow in my work over, I'm afraid, many years. I started as a lawyer, and then when I went into the academy, I became a legal philosopher. And law fans out. If you're trying to think about it and follow its lead, wherever it takes you, it fans out in many directions. If you become interested in constitutional law, then you're going to have to be interested in political philosophy. If you're interested in the theory of adjudication, you wonder how judges should decide cases, what makes a proposition of law, claim of law, true or false, then you will immediately encounter contemporary skepticism about that matter. Law students, all law students, and even some law professors love to say there's no right answer. It's what the judge had for breakfast, and that makes them feel terribly knowing, but you have to confront that if you have a different view. And that takes you into the theory of logic, and it takes you into, as we'll see, it takes you into a bit of metaphysics. If you then wonder, well, how should judges decide cases? What does make one proposition of law stand out as true? Then I think you'll have to confront the theory of interpretation. If you worry about the criminal law and the fairness of what the criminal law does to people, then you can't help encountering an ancient, very daunting philosophical problem of free will. So, in a phrase I used in a book long ago, I've tried to work from the inside out, that is, starting with legal problems, trying to start with the concrete problem, but finding theoretical assent essential. And I found myself writing about a wide variety of philosophical topics. In this book, I've tried to reverse the order. That is, I've tried to set out from the outside in a general theory of philosophy that ends with a consideration of politics and law. The first topic I take up is that topic I mentioned, skepticism. It's very popular these days. It's all around us. We went through, when I was a child, existentialism. Now we have postmodernism. And we have many fashionable theories in between, rampant in the confident departments of American universities, and even, as I said, I fear, in law schools. Skepticism seems to me a mistake. At least the kind of skepticism that's very popular, I call it unearned skepticism. Consider the following argument about a very hot topic of abortion. A says, abortion is morally wrong. It's always prohibited. B says, abortion is certainly not prohibited. On the contrary, in certain circumstances, it's morally required. C says, no, you're both wrong. It's a woman's decision, but it's not a moral decision because fetus is like an appendix. Then comes D, who says all three of you are wrong, including C. You're all wrong because there is no truth in this neighborhood. There are no values out there in the universe. You're all making a mistake. There's nothing to think about. You're just venting your emotions. Now, the point that I try and make in this book is that D's opinion is as much a moral opinion as A, B, or C's. There is no way to construe it. So it doesn't take the same moral position as C, namely abortion is permitted. If there are no moral duties, then no one has a duty not to abort. If there are no moral requirements, It's not required. Why did philosophy for so long make the mistake of not understanding what I think is a very important thing to understand, that skepticism is itself a first-order moral claim? I think the problem is that people have associated realism in morality, that is, a grand name for the thesis that there really are true and false statements about what people ought to do. People have associated that with a certain metaphysics. They say there can only be mind-independent, universal truths about morality if there are independent entities in the universe. I call them morons, moral particles which pulse in some way. Now, we can't make any sense of that, nor can we make any sense of denying it. The only way we can construe skepticism is as itself a first-order moral position. And as such, it's sometimes right. I spent many years at Oxford. This is not about morality, it's about something much less important. Every night at dinner, people would twirl their wine glasses around and say, I think this will surprise you with its audacity. I think it's slightly nobler than what we had last night. Now, I'm a skeptic about nobility in wine, but I don't think that follows because there are no wine nobility particles in the universe. I think it's just that there's no good argument. You can't make it out as an aesthetic argument. I take the same view about morality, and I take the same view about law. Now, if that's your view, if, like me, you think that a skeptical claim is just another moral claim, it must be earned, then you don't get rid of skepticism. What you get rid of is bad arguments for skepticism, very fashionable arguments. People say, cultures differ, therefore there can't be any truth of the matter. Well, if the phrase, there is no truth of the matter, is itself a moral claim, not only do cultures differ about the truth of that claim, but almost no cultures have ever embraced it until, let's say, 19th century France. We get rid of bad arguments, but then we have a challenge. What's a good argument? How should we, if we feel, as a matter of deep conviction, that something is right and something is wrong, that justice requires a decent level of health care for all citizens, what makes that true if we think it's true? And my argument is that there are no sufficient conditions to prove that it's true, and no sufficient conditions to prove that it's wrong, but there are necessary conditions. You have to be able to show that your conviction ties in with, reflects, and is supported by the rest of your convictions. That doesn't follow. Here enters the hedgehog. The hedgehog is not a matter of taste, as Isaiah Berlin thought it was. The hedgehog holds the field because of the conditions that can make a moral or aesthetic or a legal or a political judgment sound. There are no morons, and therefore only a kind of interpretive coherence will do. Only interpretive coherence will make you responsible. It won't necessarily make what you think true, because what is true is something that can't be proved. It can be felt, and it'll be felt differently by different people. But you are not responsible unless you have taken some care to integrate your judgment on a particular matter with the rest of your judgments after reflection. I call that process interpretation. And I believe, and have tried in the past, to offer a general theory of interpretation, not just interpretation of statutes and prior cases or constitutions, but interpretations across the whole range of the objects of interpretation that we encounter: historical epics, poems, plays, theological texts. We study these in every case through interpretation. And in this book, I try to offer a general theory of interpretation. I'll state my general theory crudely first. Interpretation aims to make the best it can of the object of interpretation. That's a little too crude, indeed much too crude, because it doesn't answer the obvious question: what makes a particular interpretation make a poem or a play or a statute look better? In order to answer that question, I've tried to develop a theory of critical responsibility. People who interpret do so not as a game, most of them, but because they sense a responsibility, but they differ dramatically about what that responsibility is. Take the case of lawyers. Take the case of judges on our Supreme Court. They interpret trying to make the best they can of our Constitution. What they take their responsibilities to be depends upon their theory of democracy, and they differ widely. To simplify, we have two general theories of democracy in our culture. One is a majoritarian theory that says what the people in the majority vote is for that reason what we are as a people committed to. There's a different theory of democracy that says that democracy insists that majority rule is imperative. Majority rule is valid only if certain conditions are met, only if certain rights, like the right of free speech and other rights I'll talk about in a few minutes, are met. Judges who disagree which theory of democracy is the correct one will therefore disagree about their critical responsibilities. Some will become originalists who look to the historical meaning of a phrase. Others will become advocates of what is sometimes wrongly called the living Constitution, which means they have to rethink moral issues for themselves. In the case of poetry, which I discuss in the book at some length, critical responsibilities are obviously different. If two critics interpret a poem, say Yeats's poem, among school children, if two critics interpret this, and one is a Marxist who thinks that the responsibility of a critic is to mine social meaning and reality from a classical poem, he will, of course, arrive at a different interpretation from that of a new critic or that of a biographer, for example, who will be much more interested in the details of a poet's life. This doesn't mean that there isn't a best interpretation. It means that the question of what a best interpretation is must be remitted to the deeper question: what are a critic's responsibilities? And that question evidently will fan out into aesthetic theory, and also, as I tried to illustrate by citing the Marxist critic, into politics. We therefore need a general theory of interpretation, and in a large part of the book, I try and apply that theory of interpretation to our leading political concepts, the concepts of liberty, equality, justice, democracy, following the hedgehog and following the theory that by the nature of truth in this area, we must find interpretations of these important concepts that dovetail, that support one another. It's a very widely held view that these concepts conflict with one another, that liberty can be had only at the expense of equality. Tea Party people insist on that, though they run it backwards. Liberty can be had only at the expense of equality. Democracy will mean injustice from time to time, because a democracy means majority rule, and the majority may reach unjust decisions. Now, I think this idea of conflict is wrong. And it's not just wrong because I've got theories, because I've worked out theories of each of these that, as it happens, don't conflict. I think rather that they can't conflict. We can't think that we hold all of these values unless we subject them to an interpretation which I liken to the solution of simultaneous equations. We need a theory of liberty and a theory of equality which are drawn from each other, which don't conflict, but which in fact support one another. Now, of course, I can't just insist that that must be so. I have to show that there are indeed plausible accounts of these cardinal political virtues that in fact don't conflict with one another, and a substantial part of the book is devoted to working out independent theories of these basic concepts to show that they don't conflict. One might say, for example, that liberty means the freedom to do whatever you want with what is morally yours. If that's right, then liberty and justice must be drawn together. You need a theory of each of them. That will initially sound to you like that nasty Greek Procrustes who had a bed and he lopped or stretched people to fit it. I'm sure many of you now harbor the opinion that I'm lopping or stretching these concepts so they'll fit my paradigm. But in that case, I can only urge you to follow my argument and see whether it doesn't produce the only kind of an interpretation which can bring us confidence, which is one that solves the simultaneous equations. The important concept for our politics now is the concept of equality. And I want to spend a few minutes now explaining how I think we should understand that concept. Philosophers, political philosophers, have written about equality from both the left and the right, from the liberal position and the conservative position, as if it was perfectly clear what equality means. Equality means everybody has the same of something as everybody else. Everybody has the same bank account wealth, or everyone has the same happiness, or everyone achieves the same success in life. These are all theories that you will find in the philosophical literature. And generally, as soon as someone offers a theory of that kind, equality means everybody has the same amount of money, it will follow that equality is not a very compelling ideal. So I want to start rather differently. I want to start with a general account of political obligation, of what a state in particular owes to its citizens, and see what conception of equality follows from understanding politics at that deep level. Coercive government, and that means all government of anything larger than the Carnegie Council. Coercive government needs a justification that explains why it isn't a terminal insult to human dignity to force somebody to do what he thinks wrong, as of course government must do. I argue that government lacks moral title to coerce unless it respects the dignity of its subjects. And I argue for a theory of dignity that comes to this. There is a basic condition of political legitimacy. No government is legitimate unless it meets that condition. Government must treat each and every person over whom it claims dominion with an equal concern and an equal respect. An equal concern means, I argue, that social policy must take the fate of each individual to be equally important with the fate of any other. So when deciding on a political policy, it can't discount the effect on some citizens. Obviously, it can't do that because of their race, but it can't do that because of their economic class either. Equal respect is a rather different requirement. Equal respect means that government must respect the dignity of each individual by allowing each individual to determine for himself or herself what would count as a good life, what counts as a successful life. That doesn't mean that we should be skeptical about that fundamental ethical question. It means that our idea of the good life includes, as a cardinal condition, that a good life means facing this question for yourself and arriving with conviction and living a life according to that conviction. If I'm right, a theory of equality, say economic equality, must once again solve simultaneous equations. It must reach an economic distribution which at once treats everyone's fate with equal concern and respects people's responsibility to make their own decisions. That cannot be done by achieving flat equality. It can't be done by running the community as a monopoly game in which all the money gets taken in and redistributed at the end of each year. It can't do that because that would be to make individual decisions about education, investment, leisure, completely pointless. On the other hand, government can't just say, we'll have a market, and wherever the market ends, we will consider equal treatment. Because people who are disabled or people who do not have the talent to make what the market demands will suffer, and they'll suffer in ways that have nothing to do with the choices they made, have nothing to do with their own responsibility. How do we solve this simultaneous equation? How do we treat people both with equal concern and respect equally their responsibility to make decisions for themselves? There are two models on the whole, not necessarily liberal political theory. One is the model of a social contract. That is, as you know, a model first presented by Thomas Hobbes, not a very liberal version of it, and then over the centuries presented in different forms by John Locke, Immanuel Kant, and in our day, John Rawls, celebrated political philosopher. The other tradition is more recent. It's a Fabian tradition. It's a tradition that came to the United States in the administration of the New Deal, in Franklin Roosevelt's administration. Came to England a little earlier. And that is taking social insurance as a model for economic justice. And I think that the idea of insurance is one that actually does give us a way of respecting both. I develop in these pages what I call a hypothetical insurance model for taxation. It's rather complicated, and the economic literature that it's generated is rather daunting. I can only understand about half of the economic literature telling me why I'm right or wrong. But the basic idea is this. We don't aim to make people equal ex post, that is, after fate has decided whose investments mature and whose don't, whose education succeeds and who doesn't. Rather, we try, because that, as I've said, would make it impossible to respect people's responsibility for their own lives. Rather, we try to make people equal ex ante, that is, before any of these events occur. How do we do that? By a hypothetical thought experiment. Suppose people, average people, had equal amounts of wealth and were insurance risks equal. That is, community rating, as they say in the insurance trade. Suppose that was so. What insurance would people at the beginning, at some notional beginning, buy if they didn't think they were any more likely to suffer disadvantages of these various sorts? They would not insure to the hilt. They would not say, I want to be sure I earn no less than anybody else, because it would cost too much. They would have nothing left out of which to lead their life. The premium would be staggering. But they would insure, if they were rational, at a higher level than our tax system now guarantees. My claim is that the only way of a government to meet its condition of legitimacy adequately is by remodeling its tax and redistribution system to follow this hypothetical insurance scheme, to say to people, we will guarantee that you will be no worse off than almost anyone, or at least the great bulk of people like you would have insured to prevent. It's not too expensive to do that. It can't be too expensive because it's modeled on an insurance market. We collect from people in taxes the premiums that we believe people would have paid in this experiment, and we redistribute to those who have suffered in the amount they would have insured to cover. As I said a few minutes ago, the details of this are complicated and people disagree what the result would be. I mention it here to illustrate one possibility, it seems to me a compelling possibility, of how to respond to these twin demands of legitimacy on government. What is the status of my claim that I've just made and the other very large claims I make throughout the book about what justice requires, what legitimacy requires? As I said, the status of these claims is an interpretive integrity. We have a responsibility, philosophers have part of the burden of this responsibility, to think about these concepts in the way I've tried to describe. We have that responsibility simply as a matter of our ethical faith with ourselves, if we want to regard ourselves as responsible. There is no shortcut. We can't say, oh, our values conflict, so I like liberty or I like equality. We have to think it through. And in the end, however, each of us may be responsible. We may compose and construct perfectly integrated interpretations which end differently. No doubt we often will. At that point, come back to the beginning of my remarks, we have to disown any kind of skepticism. Yes, we must test our convictions, but if they pass the interpretive test and we hold these convictions authentically, then I would suggest to you that if you can't help at the end of all this but believe something, then you better believe it. Thank you.